Good evening. Sorry for the late connection. Okay, so welcome back to my call. Thank you. We're starting a new perek on page 215. I believe that's where we're at. I've just got to share screen 1 second. Recording for Darren. Okay, here we go. So we sort of spent the last, goodness knows, couple of months really discussing the halachot of Kriyat Shema. And what we're going to look at now is just to sort of end off the whole sort of section of Kriyat Shema by looking at not the kavanah which one has to have for Kriyat Shema, which is what we discussed previously, but rather to look at the setting in which one, not the negative kavanah, we're going to see that in a moment, but rather the setting in which one may or may not recite Shema. Now, some of this seems a little bit sort of outdated, and I think it's important to also remember the sugyot based on the realities of the time when people were, I don't know whether it was they were sharing one room, sharing one bed, they had one blanket, and their clothes were their blankets, and you think of sort of the impoverished reality in which they lived, in order to understand the sugyot, many of which may not be directly relevant today, but nonetheless, we're still what to learn from them in terms of the nature of the sanctity of Kriyat Shema, and that's what we will look at. Bezrat Hashem. I'll also just quick pitch that I'm looking to make an advanced Iyun B'Halacha Chabura on Thursday evenings at 8:30, where we'll learn through Tzurba Shiur. 8:30. We're looking at 8:30 on Tuesday evenings. So if people want to learn through Tzurba Shiur and Poskim, probably in Hebrew, we're getting a little Chabura. Please speak to Harry Mainzer, who is the official shamash as of a few hours ago. So there you go. Just something to advertise. Okay. Let's I'll just share screen, okay, because I've got a couple of watchers at home. Hello, Jeff. Hello, Yitz. Hello, Darren, who might be watching the recording of this in Israel. Okay, so on page 215. So what is the whole question of Erev Fast? So there's this prohibition for somebody to be undressed when reciting Shema and Brachot, or to be in front of somebody else who is undressed when reciting Shema. So the first source, and this is on page 215, source 1, in Masechet Brachot, the Gemara tells us, Amar Rava says Rava, So'a ba'ashashit mutar likro kriyat Shema kenegda. So if there's literally feces, for example, even let's say a dirty nappy or something, but it's in a glass, it's covered in ashashit is literally a glass covering, like a lamp covering. So it's a see-through covering, transparent covering. Someone was to put over the tso'ah, then it would be permissible to read Shema in its presence. The tso'ah b'kisoi talia milta, because tso'ah, right, feces, it would depend as long as it's covered up. And it's covered up. So the fact that you can see it is not the issue. The issue with it is it has to be covered up. That's when it comes to something unpleasant being in the room for reciting Shema. It doesn't matter that it's visible as long as it's basically covered. Erva ba'ashashit asur. But if somebody was to cover themselves up with a see-through and transparent covering, that would be prohibited. Likrot kriyat Shema kenegda. So if there's somebody who was undressed with a transparent covering only over themselves, it will be prohibited to read Kriyat Shema in front of such a thing. Because the Torah says you should not have an ervat davar among yourselves, literally a nakedness of a thing, meaning an indecent thing. Amarachmana, that's what the Torah says. And it is being seen. So it's not davar, because you can see it through transparent glass or transparent covering. So there's a prohibition to see erva. To see erva at the time of reciting Shema, and therefore there cannot be anybody who can be unclothed and uncovered. What does it mean to be unclothed? So at this stage, when we talk about erva, we literally talk about the private areas, and that's what we're sort of referring to at this stage when we discuss erva. But we will expand exactly what erva is and how much one cannot be undressed or other people around them cannot be undressed. So this is actually paskined by the Rambam in source 2, as bizarre as it sounds. In source 2, the Rambam rules, same way it's prohibited to read in front of feces or urine, until one moves himself away from it. So too, it's also prohibited to read Shema in front of nakedness, in front of erva, until one turns one's head away. Even if it's a non-Jew or a katan, one should not read in front of their erva. Even if there was a glass wall separation between them, However, it's still prohibited, and as one sees the erva, one would have to look away. It's a bit of a weird one, but when might situations like this come up? Certainly not only Kriyat Shema, but certainly the old days when people shared a room and that sort of thing. But any sort of brachot or davar shepik kedusha, the question of erva we're going to discuss and how much one can or must be covered. We will discuss, but the question of any sort of reciting brachot, let's say somebody comes out of the mikveh or comes out of a swimming pool or something like that, or there's a bathroom off to the side of the swimming pool, and even if it's all men, so the question is, well, can one recite brachot in the vicinity? How much does one have to be covered? How much do other people have to be covered? So although a lot of this is not directly relevant today, the sugyot are connected to modern day questions nonetheless. Okay. So it's a bit bizarre, but bear with me and we'll get through it. Okay. Sorry? All good? Aaron's already.
I think that's right.
Sorry?
I think it's a bit bizarre.
Bit bizarre. Okay. Okay, but look at this next Gemara, which will sort of show us exactly the reality with which Chazal were dealing. In source 3 here. So we go over the page in Brachot Kaf Dal Lamed Bet in source 3. This talks about somebody who was sleeping unclothed and their blanket was their clothes. This is a reality. You have somebody living in poverty. They didn't have pajamas or whatever it was, but all they had was their talit, their coat, their cloak, which or their blanket.
And they didn't have underwear.
Sorry, and they didn't have underwear. Right. That's the assumption here. Look at source 3. So Tana Rabbanan, we learned it in a Braita. Our rabbis taught. Yashen b'talito, somebody was sleeping in their cloak or in their talit or their blanket. It's too cold to stick their head out. Don't forget, they were so poor, they couldn't afford clothes, they certainly couldn't afford heating. So they're in the freezing cold underneath a blanket, and they have to recite Shema, but all they've got is their blanket. Okay, and the problem is they are undressed. So they're undressed inside their blanket with their blanket over their head. So what can they do? Because they don't want to stick their head out as a chatzitza, as a separation, because it's freezing cold. Chotzetz b'talito al savarov or koreh kriyat Shema. So they make a separation with one's garment around one neck and they read Kriyat Shema. What does this mean? It means they like push in the blanket rather than having it loosely. They push in the blanket around their neck and then they can recite Kriyat Shema. The Yeshom, remember those that say that it's not good enough to do it there, but it has to be al libo, over one's heart. So there has to be a separation between one's heart and one's erva. But Tanakama, what about the first opinion? Hare liboro et erva. How are you allowed to do that? Surely one's heart literally means liboro et erva means literally one's heart sees one's nakedness. It means that there's no separation between one's heart and one's private area. Kasavar, he holds liboro et erva mutar. There's no such issue with one's heart being in the same vicinity as a person who's undressed, as one's private parts essentially. A bit of a bizarre one, but we see from here there's this machloket about the following halacha. Liboro et erva. Can one's heart be in the same vicinity as one's erva and in that manner recite Shema? And there's a machloket as to whether the heart can be or it's just the head that has to be out, or the heart also has to be out. There's a minhag gaman chasidim which came as a result of this Gemara, which is what? Gartel. Why they put the gartel around the middle? To separate the heart from the erva. Comes from here. Comes from this sugya.
Can I ask you?
You can ask. I can't promise I'll give you the answers you want because we're dealing with a different metziut. Okay. Yeah. Go for it. Well, this isn't practical halakha, so we're okay.
We spent a couple of weeks talking about having covered up and having the right intention when we're saying Kriyat Shema. And I don't know if it's in this section or the last section. Was talking about a guy who was too young to get out of bed.
The last section, yeah.
If you're going to say Kriyat Shema, you couldn't have said, can't you? My head spun when I read that. I thought, if you're too sick to say Tefillah, then I'm sure a Kodesh Baruch Hu would understand. And if you couldn't be bothered standing up for Kodesh Baruch Hu, then how does that fit with?
So it's a very good question. You know, you lean to the side because you can't turn over, you can't sit up because the guy was too big to sit up. Rabbi Yochanan, right? You should see the Gemara's about Rabbi Yochanan. He was a Baal Basar. Talk about him.
Yeah. So how does that fit with this? Where a guy, it's cold. I get that. I mean, there's no central heating where this was run. I get that. But for goodness sake, if you're going to do tefillot, you get up and you dress yourself adequately, and you don't just take your head out of the blanket. That's how I. And if it's too cold, I'm sure Kodesh Baruch Hu understands it's cold. So,
but the point is, there's a prohibition to recite Shema in front of Erevah, in front of one's nakedness. That's the problem they're dealing with. Is this the ideal situation? I don't think anyone thinks that.
I don't care how holy they are; they couldn't possibly have concentration if they've got a naked woman or even a naked.
But here, at this stage, talking about what in front of oneself. That it's not because of improper thought, it's just because it's inappropriate for one to be reciting the name of Hashem when one is undressed.
You should dress properly.
But now they didn't have any.
They didn't have clothes. It's very depressing to read this Gemara because you realize that this is literally all they had. Right. I didn't bring the turntable today. There you go.
So that's his blanket, that's his clothes, that's everything. So he's lying in bed, he's got this on. He might cover himself over with it rather than wearing it.
Look, if he's got a cloak on, like a shmata like we see, Bedouin walking out.
So I'm saying think like lahavdil, think like the monk garment or the Bedouin shmata with no rope. That's what we had. And no undergarments either. That's what we're dealing with. Literally a whole.
I got that. I understand that. He's the shmata that is wearing.
Okay, I'll just sum it up like this. Lechatchila, ideally, of course, this is not ideal according to anyone. Question is, in the mitziyut, somebody realizes, I haven't recited Shema. Is there an obligation on them, and what can they do in this situation? That's what the Gemara is dealing. But what you learn by the by is various halachot about libora to erva, that the heart cannot be in the same place as one's erva, and that's what we see from here. So there's a machloket is whether liboro to erva or not, whether one's heart can be in the same literal vicinity as one's erva or not. Which, ironically, interesting enough, does become a discussion in Tosfot as to how we pass it in source 4. Look at source 4, Tosfot bring a machloket amongst two of the Baalei Tosfot. Perush Ri, says the Ri in source 4, Midaparich Gemara Hachi, Bepshitat Mashma de Libroet Asur. From the fact that the Gemara asked this question, then it's clear that it was rejecting the opinion which allowed it. And clearly we follow the halacha that Liboro et Asur, that it's Asur, it's prohibitive for the heart to be in the same place as one's erva. That was what the Ri said. Ella, however, the Rabbeinu Shemaya, and here we have a little bio. They don't always give a biography, but Rabbeinu Shemaya, who was Talmido Shel Rashi, Pasak, he ruled, Katana Kama, like the first opinion, that it's okay for the heart and the erva to be in the same vicinity. Of Miu, however, the Samach later on, Mashma implies that Asr is prohibited. Later on, there's a machloket about whether one's feet, one's heels could be in the same vicinity as one's erva. But later on in the Gemara, it says if one's heart sees one's erva, everyone agrees, modu da asur, that it's prohibited. So Tosfot bring both opinions. Ultimately, Tosfot themselves seem to say we rule that the lev, that the heart and the erva cannot be in the same place, and therefore there must be separation between the heart and the erva. And again, we're talking here about a mitzvah, to reality where they had one long beged, no undergarments. There has to be a belt or something in between, and that's what they're ruling. If we go over the page, that's how the Shulchan Aruch rules based on the vast majority of Rishonim, that the lev, the heart, and the erva cannot be in the same covering, and there has to be a separation of a belt or something in between. Let's see in source 5. What if you don't have a belt in source 5? So says the Shulchan Aruch, Haya yashen arum betalitos. Again, one was sleeping undressed in one's clothes. Sarich lachutz betalit al libo. One must press down their talit on one's heart, va'az yikra, and then read. In other words, they have a loose garment on, this shmata, blanket, whatever it is. One must press in on it here, mishum de liboro et erva asur, in order because it's prohibited for the heart to be in the same cloth as the erva when one recites Shema. So we're talking here about something which obviously covered the whole body, and that has to be pressed in. But if there were two separate garments, there's no issue, which is why this whole sugya doesn't really relate to nowadays at all. But nonetheless, the minhag of the Hasidim to put a gartel on comes from this.
Except that there's more to the gartel than just that, because the gartel is really a belt that goes on the Becky chair.
No, but the reason they put the gartel, I love it. You see gartels going over hoodies, you see gartels going over everything. But it's the idea, it's the Chassidut, it's the Midat Chassidut of saying the lev needs to be separated from the erva. So even though people have separate, people don't wear onesies, right? People don't wear onesies, and people wear undergarments, and people wear pants with elastic, but still there's this minhag to do it. Is it necessary? I think we all know the answer to that in today's clothing. But look in source 6, this is how the Mishnah Berurah explains it. The Mishnah Berurah says, and he also explains that the halacha is not only about Kriyat Shema, which is important, but it's about any words of Torah or brachot. So in source 6 says the Mishnah Berurah, Hayashen Arum, a person was sleeping undressed. Hamachaber tafas l'shon haGemara. So the author, the Machaber, i.e. the Shulchan Aruch, was just using the language of the Gemara to Sham Shayach Lishna, because that's the language it used. Aval be'inyanenu, but in our terms, hu hadin, the same is true. K'shehaya yashen b'chaluko b'lo michnesayim. Someone was sleeping in a robe. Let's say they went to bed just in a bathrobe. Gamken, without any pants. Gamken, that's also din hachi. The halacha is also this way. The asr b'divrei Torah, that it is prohibited with divrei Torah, or levarech shum bracha, or to make any bracha, ad sheyadbik biyadav haktonet b'makom halev. That he has to press with his hands the tunic or the shirt in, or the robe in on the place of the heart, or below the heart. Again, separating the areas, which that's what's key here. But firstly, the Mishnah Berurah extends it to all Dvarim Shebik Dusha, and any mention of a bracha. By the way, learning Torah as well is also in there. So reciting Divrei Torah in a bathrobe is a problem. What? Is a problem, unless one's got a belt. Or underwear. Okay, which we're going to discuss now. So the question is, how this is all very nice discussion. It's a nice idea. Why the lev, by the way? Why is it that the lev? Why is it the heart has to be separated from the erva? The first opinion, the Gemara said only the head, right? Why the lev? Why the heart? On your heart. But the word's got to be on your heart, and the heart's got to be pure, and keep that separate. Okay. Okay. Sorry? That's why some people hold this here, right? Correct. So this is all very interesting sugya, but tachlis, practically, okay, how relevant is this? So the Chazon Ish says it's not too relevant in any modern clothing. We look over in source 7, says the Chazon Ish, not Archaim, he says, when you read, it would seem the dafka b'chaluk rachav, only if someone had a particularly wide garment, she'asoi shiram me'al basaro, it's made to like float or hover above one's garment, like a loose robe, right? And then the heart would be uncovered in front of one's erva. Only in such a case, asur, would it be prohibited. Even the garments worn on the heart. But any tight-fitted clothing, like any modern piece of clothing, any shirts, right, which are a bit tighter, they're not loose. That is like a belt. It's equivalent of what the Gemara was saying in terms of pushing the clothes in. If somebody wore basically not a onesie, but you wore just something on one's heart alone and one's erva was covered, it's not considered that his heart is in the same areas. So and when the cloak is wearing one's whole body, somebody's in a dressing gown or a bathrobe, then then somebody has to tighten the garment on one's heart or below the heart. And the tightening is considered a separation. But practically, what we see is it doesn't really apply to modern clothing, because firstly they're more tight fitting, and it's not loose, and they're usually also separate. People don't wear onesies typically to daven and recite Shema, and if they do, they're tighter, so it's okay, says the Chazon Ish. So none of this really applies to, sorry,
and not see-through.
And they're not see-through, right? See-through would be another issue. Okay, so the question is, okay, so we've established that modern clothing is okay, but does somebody have to be wearing a shirt to recite brachot? Meaning, or it's enough just to be wearing pants or something like that? Does somebody have to be wearing upper garments? Or is it enough just to be wearing lower garments? So it's complicated, like everything in Judaism, it's complicated. So the Gemara in Brachot says that for Amida one does, Kriyat Shema one doesn't. Piskei Teshuvot cites now, which we're going to see in the next source, which is that it's best nonetheless lechatchila always to be wearing at least a shirt as well for out covered. Even though Mi'ikar Hadin it's not required for Shema. So we'll see that inside in the next source. Piskei Teshuvot is source 8. He says, Ervato mechusa b'michnasayim, amachasim heitev ervato. Somebody whose erva is covered because they're wearing pants properly, which covers one's area. Smudim b'katzeh elyon hagufo, right? Yo'il le'amirat brachot ishad rensheh b'kedusha. But it's good enough, as long as one's wearing pants, it's good enough to recite brachot and other matters of kedusha. Afilu pele gufo ha'elyon meguleh. Even if the upper part of one's body is uncovered, strictly speaking, it's okay. Aval, however, mikol makom, nonetheless, mishum kvod habracha, out of respect for the bracha, nachon, it's correct, lechatchila, ideally, sheyechaseg gufo gam mimat navo lemala, also to cover the top half of one's body, but kisoy hagun with an appropriate covering, or mechubad, a respectful covering, but kol shkein, how much more so lekriyat shema. Okay. So he says, mi'ikar hadin, strictly speaking, one doesn't need to be wearing a shirt, but it's covered and it's correct to do so, and how, for brachot, and how much more so for shema. But for Amida, chayev medina lehitlabesh kohagen. So if it's prohibited to not have a shirt on for Amida. And the truth is, also for reciting Torah, one should also be wearing a shirt to be dressed properly. So the Piskei Teshuvot essentially says that Mikar Hadin, strictly speaking, one doesn't need to wear a shirt, but it's proper too. And for Amida, one has to. The Gemara makes this chiluk, this division between Amida versus Kriyat Shema in brachot, and the Gemara says that one, strictly speaking, for Kriyat Shema does not need to be wearing clothing, upper garments, only, whereas in Amida one has to be fully dressed. And Rashi brings a wonderful explanation there. It's not brought here, I don't believe, but Rashi brings a wonderful explanation. He says because Kriyat Shema, unlike Amida, is not Amida lifnei hamelech. Those are the words that Rashi uses. Rav Lichtenstein Zatzal brought it in Shir Klali years ago when I was new to Yeshiva. He brought it when we were learning brachot 10 years ago. Literally 10 years ago, we were learning brachot, and he brought this Rashi, I remember, in Masechet Brachot, who says the difference between Kriyat Shema versus Tefillah is because Tefillah is Omed Lifnei HaMelech, you're standing before the king, whereas Kriyat Shema is not, and that's why the Gemara makes this chiluk, this discrepancy between Kriyat Shema versus Amida. Nonetheless, we've seen that it's still nachon lechatchila. It's correct that even for brachot, and how much more so for Kriyat Shema, it's still proper that one should ideally be fully clothed. Okay, so that's a little bit regarding this.
Rav Johnny,
Yes.
Wouldn't it also depend on where you are? Like if you're in a Beit Knesset or a Beit Midrash or something like that, rather than.
Well, I think right. It's an interesting point. I think it's obvious that out of Kedushat Hamakom, our sanctity for the place, that one would not be walking around partially undressed. But we're saying even to do Kriyat Shema at one's home or to recite brachot at home, or someone goes to the bathroom, for example, and wants to recite Asher Yatzar, so then that's when the question would arise. That even so, it's nachon, it's proper that one should be covered for brachot. Hospital gown. So that's the best example I can think of like a modern day, like, you know, what do you hospital gown? There's have to be some sort of separation. Dr. Ween, correct me if I'm they're not particularly tight fitted, are they? They're pretty loose. Hospital gown and bathrobe, right? That's the point, right? Yeah. But do they hand out maybe that? So that's one place in Ikar Hadin you need a gartel maybe to daven, would be a hospital gown. So they hand out gartels in there. They have to. They have a belt. They have a. They do have. They don't. They have a strap.
Yeah.
They do in Israel. Maybe there's Truma in Israel. They have a tie. They have a tie. So that tie, yeah. But that tie makes it haduk in the words of the poskim. It makes it so it's not flapping. That's the point. So, but that's when the Hasidim should be giving out gartels for the hospital. Because for hospital belts is one is.
Most of the time they're wearing underwear as well.
Okay, there you go. Okay, Seder. So okay. So where are we at? Okay, we are at the end of page 218.
So just an example.
Yes. Hospital gown.
Your front is covered. So would that qualify as being enough of a separation?
It would seem so, yeah. Okay. We're not talking about, yeah, go on. And then we'll move on to something a bit more lamasa, a bit more practical, yeah.
Just checking the Chazanish. Chazanish is 1930s to 1950s. This case,
It's modern day. Yeah.
That's modern, is it?
Rabinovitz, yeah.
Is that an explanation on the Mishnah Berurah?
Piskei Teshuvah, he brings post Mishnah Berurah. He's post Mishnah. Yes. He's post Mishnah Berurah. Rav Rabinowitz, Rav Simcha Rabinowitz, he puts together still alive. He brings together like modern day poskim and different things, and he sort of summarizes it even after the Mishnah
That's
Berurah.
Rabbi Rabinowitz.
Yes, Rav Simcha Rabinowitz. Okay. All right. So as we said, most of this is not so relevant in a shul, but even at home, that's when it's more relevant, as Jeff pointed out. Okay. What about thinking about words of Torah? So if we look over the page here, the Yalkut Yosef, Rav Yitzchak Yosef recites here in source 9 that the prohibition of being undressed would only be to recite words of Torah or brachot or kriyat shema. But to think words of Torah, perhaps there would not be an issue, which is an interesting one to think about. He talks here about, can you think about Torah in the bath or in the shower? You're not allowed to say it, but can you think it? Now, this is assuming that there's no issue of a toilet being in the bathroom, because that was another issue we discussed earlier, which is that if there's a toilet in the bathroom, then it's an issue anyway. But let's say you're so holy, you can't stop thinking about Torah, and you're one of those people.
Except the modern toilet is not really.
A modern toilet, so we discussed this in the past about a bathroom with a toilet in, but if there's a separation or there's a wall in between or something,
But even if the toilet itself is not really.
or you've got
And
the
it's
good
flat.
doors, you've got the good doors of the shower, and it's a separate room entirely once you close the door. So are you allowed to think of words of Torah in the bath or in the shower? You're not allowed to recite them, but can you think them? And according to Rav Yitzchak Yosef, you can. No, or at least b'diavad, it's okay. Look at source 9 here. Aser likro kriyat shema or hitpalel or levarach bracha v'lo makod vasha b'kedusha. It's prohibited to recite shema or any tefillah or brachot, or lilmod b'divrei Torah, or to learn Torah. 1 second, Manny. Kishehu arum, when one's undressed. Kol shelibo ro'eh te'erva, as long as one's heart is in the same area as one's private areas. V'lo dai b'mash mekasek gufo. It's not enough to cover one's body. V'gam keneged chavero shu arum. Same if someone else, if not yourself, if someone else is also undressed. Because it says in the Torah, an erva, an uncovering of a matter should not be in front of you. Ulam, however, all of this is ba'ofen shu motzi bisfatav. It's only if one actually verbalizes the words. Aval imrak maharher b'divrei Torah. If you're only thinking the Torah, mutter, it's permissible. The Darshan Chazal, because Chazal said, davar leshon dibur. Davar implies speech. Dibur asur, hirhur mutar. And then he goes and he takes this further, and then I'll take Manny's question. Lefikach, therefore, hamit rachet ba'ambatya pratit. Someone's having a private bath. Mutalo lehachnis tape. Tape is a tape recorder. Lishma divrei kedusha. Isn't that fascinating? Again, we're assuming there's no toilet in the bathroom, or there's a separate room or whatever. But if you bring in tape, you can listen. So my brother-in-law asked me about listening to Jewish music in the shower. Listen to Jewish music in the shower.
Nice.
Sorry, well, according to this, if it's no toilet in there, whatever, or it's separate, where there's a wall in the way, whatever it is, there's no worries. You're not allowed to say it, but he's mutter to bring in a tape. Isn't that crazy? Lishma divrei kedusha, and you're allowed to hear words of kedusha. This is Rav Yitzchak Yosef writing. Afal pishu omed arum mitrachet. Even though he's undressed and is washing naked, it's okay. And when he hears them, he's allowed to think about them. To hear her lav kadibru, that means the halachic principle that thinking is not like speech, and therefore it's okay. But mamurim, this is on condition that what? That in the bathroom, ein sham beit hakiseh sherutin. There's no actual toilet in there. Havel im yesh sham beit kiseh asur. But as we said before, if there's an actual toilet in the bathroom, that's a problem. Even in our modern toilets, or at least according to Rabbi Avadja and Rabbi Yitzchak, his son Rabbi Yitzchak, asur leharher b'divrei Torah, you're not allowed to think that way. And similarly, beit merchatz, a public bathhouse, shemitrachsim sham rabim, where many people go for washing, asur leharher b'divrei Torah, b'toch hacheder hapanimi sheba mitrachsim, you're not allowed to think there, b'shum denefisha zuhama, because it's a foul smell. But in a private bathroom where there's no toilet, Rav Yitzchak Yosef allows one to listen to divrei Torah. You're not allowed to recite them yourself, but you're allowed to listen to them and to think about them. Yes, Reb Kingsley.
I was just wondering, what sort of a bar madrega would you have to be able to shut off your mind and sort of compartmentalize your thinking processes? The only reason you could probably have a tape in there is because it's a distraction from what you might be thinking otherwise. But if you're such a bar madrega to think divrei Torah in all places, it would be difficult to switch off. But unfortunately, we're not at that bar madrega where we think of Torah in most places, so it's probably not a worry to think about in the bathroom because we just don't practically do it.
Yes,
But
it's
if you did
interesting,
it, but if you did it, how would you switch your mind off?
say that again. If you, I think it's just, sorry, 1 second, just grab a minion. Just 1 second, just minion, are you good for Mariv? Are you, sorry, you ready to have Mariv? Please be good for Mariv. Okay. Mercedes, sorry about that. So I think we're dealing here with, in general, somebody who wants to. It's interesting as the Madrega, Rav Avadia, so Rabbi Yitzchak Yosef's father, Avadia wrote about people who are going to have inappropriate thoughts in the bathroom, and it's better that they think about Torah than other things. That was about a bathroom. But we're not even discussing that here. I think we're just discussing about if one is allowed to listen to a shiur in the bath. And apparently the answer is yes. As to the Madrega, I can't comment. I don't think most of us are on this Madrega, I have to say. I say, please God, we should find enough time, that, not in the bathroom, or not in the bathroom, in the shower, that we have to learn Torah, let alone suddenly I need, while I'm in the bath, I have to hear this shiur,
So can I say a Hasidic vote?
You can say it.
Okay. It says in Halacha, Hilchas Tefillah Tzadik Beis Siv Beis, it says, also the Zohar B'Shas of Zohar B'Shas of Afilim Yesh Lo Avnei She'ein Bo Re'es Erva. You wear a gartel, so you shouldn't say an erva during the time of davening. If you're in the bath, right, and you can't stop from seeing an erva because you're in the bath laid out, why would you be able to listen to the shiur?
So we said, because here Horalav Ketibur Dami. So we already discussed in the first part of the shiur, we discussed about Libo Roet Erva. And we said that would apply to Dibur, but here Horalav Ketibur Dami. Thinking is contemplating is not the same as speech. That's the heter that it's based on.
Okay. Shkoyach.
But so bring a gartel in the bathroom wouldn't help because there's still an issue of seeing.
Because unless you wear clothing.
Right, exactly.
Which they used to do in English public schools until the 1920s. You'd shower with a gown on.
Mishum sneers. Okay.
Well, I wouldn't say that, but I just a bit
okay. Shakoach. Okay, so let's look at the next thing. So we discussed obviously Ereva, but what about members of the opposite gender? Okay, because the rules of Ereva when it comes to women are different when it comes to men. This is in general in terms of Hilchot Sniut, and obviously things like Kisui Rosh, head coverings and things where the requirements are different between women and men. And the question is, what does that mean in terms of reciting Shema and other things in front of women who are not dressed? And not only that, but what happens if one wants to recite Shema, Kriyat Shema al Hamita, and one's wife is not dressed, or she doesn't have a head covering on, and she usually has a head covering on? Is that an issue? So this is what we're going to look at now. Sorry, or not? Very good. Wicked. Okay. Beseda. So this is a bit of an interesting Gemara to look at. In source 10 in Brachos discusses the sugya of erva with an isha, and what is considered to be erva, undressed when it comes to women. So in source 10, now remember, we have to wait till you get to the maskana, to the conclusion of the paragraph, before you all go crazy. Okay, source 10. Amar Rabbi Yitzchak says tefach be'isha erva. So a tefach, a handbreadth amount of a woman's skin which is revealed, is considered erva. Lemai, in what regard? If we say to not to look at her, surely Rav Sheshet says, Lama mana mina katav tashit isha b'chutz tashit isha b'fnim. Lamar lecha, the pasuk elsewhere in Sefer Bamidbar talks about the jewelry outside, or the outside of woman versus jewelry which is into underneath her clothing, is to teach you. This is one of the famous lines of Chazal. Kol hamistakel be'etzba katana shel isha. Anyone who gazes, when we say gaze, it means gaze with desire, at the small finger of a woman, uncovered, ki'ilu mistakel b'mukom ha'toref, as if he's looking at her private areas. So you're not really supposed to look or gaze, out of desire at a woman in any area. So what do you mean by tefach? So ella, rather, what does it mean? Be'ishto, it's referring to one's own wife. Kriyat Shema, and in terms of Kriyat Shema, that when the Gemara said Tefach B'Isha Erva, that one is not supposed to recite anything in front of a woman who is uncovered by Tefach, it's not referring, you're not supposed to, it's not talking about gazing out of desire, because you're not supposed to gaze desire at any woman. Rather, it's talking about one should not recite Kriyat Shema in front of a woman who's undressed, even in front of one's own wife. Okay. The Gemara goes on to give further parameters as to what is considered undressed in terms of Kriyat Shema. So Amar Rav Chisda says, Rav Chisda, Shok B'Isha Erva. So the thigh of a woman is considered an Erva. Shneimar, it says, Gali Shok Avri Naharot. Uktivin also says, Tagel Ervatech V'gam Tirach Patech, that you should your nakedness is revealed and your shame is revealed. Amar Shmuel says, and this one is better known, Kol B'Isha Erva. A voice of a woman is also considered an Erva. Shneimar, as it says, Ki Kolech Arev Marech Naver, right from Shir Shirim, that your voice is appealing and your appearance is beautiful. Amar Rav Sheshes says, Seya B'Isha Erva. Also, the hair of a woman is also considered Erva. Shneimar, as it says, Sa'arech Ke'eder Ha'izim. Also from Shir Shirim, that your hair flows like a goat. I'm not really sure why that's a compliment, but ask Shlomo HaMelech. But it means like a flock of goats. It means like it trails down. Okay, so we learn that these various things, the shoka, even by one's own wife, would seem to be an issue when it comes to Kriyat Shema. That one wouldn't even in front of one's own wife be able to recite Kriyat Shema if she is not fully dressed. So what does this mean? What does this mean? So first we've got to see what the Shulchan Aruch says just in general, and then we'll discuss also how perhaps things might have changed over time. So how does the Shulchan Aruch codify that weird Gemara that we just learned in Brachot? So let's look in source 11, Arachaim Ayin Hey. In source 11, the Shulchan Aruch says, Tefach magula be'isha, when if one is looking at a revealed tefach is obviously hand breadth, either 8 centimeters or 9.6 centimeters, Chazon Ish versus Rechaim Naeh. But makom shedarka lechasato, in a place which is usually covered, afilu hi ishto, even if it's one's own wife, asur likrot kriyat shema kenegda, one's not supposed to read kriyat shema in front of a woman who's undressed. Se'ar shel isha shedarka lechasato, asur likrot kenegdo. So this is where things get a bit complicated. That one should not even read Kriyat Shema in front of one's wife's uncovered hair. Says Hagar, says the Rama, afilu ishto, even in front of one's own wife. So according to this, it would seem that if one's wife is in bed and she's not got a kisui rosh on, she's not covering her hair, one really shouldn't be reciting Kriyat Shema in front of it. We'll see how we carry that down in a minute. But that's what he says here. Afilu ishto. Aval, however, says the Shulchan Aruch, the tzulot, right, unmarried women, shedarkan lelech pruot rosh, who don't cover their hair, mutar, there's no issue. Hagar adds the Ramah, but who adin, and the same is true. Hasarot shel nashim, the hair of women, sheragilin latzet, over the page, who typically do it, the hair that does hang out. So if a woman has bits, whatever that stick out of her hat or whatever, which is typical, that doesn't count. Mechutz l'simtan, outside of the hair covering, that's not considered an issue. How much more so se'ar nochrit, right? A shaitel, it doesn't, literally fake hair, right? Se'ar nochrit, foreign hair, that's not considered an issue. Afilu darka lechasot, even if hair that she usually covers. Gimel.
So woman has no hair.
If a woman has no hair, so now you're getting into a difference to go at. Is it kisui rosh or kisui se'ar? But it's a different.
She shaved her head because then
Well, that's you're talking about the Hungarian minhag that they would to shave their heads, and based on
there's no issue of showing an uncovered hair, but it's an area which is normally covered. So is that been?
So that would probably be an issue, but there are other issues there if the woman is shaving her hair because she wants to be so firm that she. Okay, we don't do that. Okay, we don't do that. Say it. Gimel. Also, one should not be listening to a woman singing when they're reciting Kriyat Shema. Hagar adds the Rama, even with one's own wife. But obviously, her speaking voice, that's not an issue. So what do we see from here, though? That the parameters of what usually one is allowed with one's own wife are prohibited when it comes to Kriyat Shema. That one is not allowed to things which which only apply typically to other women would apply to when it comes to Kriyat Shema, even with one's own wife. So that's what's really the chiddush, the novelty here when it comes to Kriyat Shema. Such is the sanctity of Kriyat Shema that that even things which one usually would be allowed to do, one cannot do in the presence of, as in one cannot recite in front of one's own wife. So how do we really translate this? So before we translate this into sort of modern day questions, like for example, going to sleep or whatever it is, the Mishnah Berurah talks about exactly what the idea is. Why is it that you do what's usually covered? So when I discuss with Chatanim as well, because what we deal with Nida, so Hilchos Nida and the Harchakot of Nida also, it's a question as to how much one's allowed to see one's wife undressed when she's a Nida in general. So we often use this phrase that the Shulchan Aruch here uses, "Makom shedarka." What is typically the norm? What is the social norm? So like obviously a man's not allowed to see his wife undressed when she's Nida. So the question is, well, what is undressed? So we typically say, and what I say to Chatanim is, you go by the social norm. If she usually goes around the house in a t-shirt and short sleeves, then that's okay for Nida as well, because that's the social norm. If she usually goes around the house without a kisei rosh on, then also when she's a Nida, that's the norm, and therefore that would be okay. So we have this idea in Hilchos Nida as well, but also here this idea of what is the social norm. So if however she normally dresses around the house, so that might be also okay when it comes to reciting Shema in front of her. So let's say she has short sleeves pajamas, for example. So we look in source 12, but Makom shedarka, whatever is the norm, says the Mishnah Berurah, because it's only talking about things which are usually covered, because that is what obviously leads somebody to improper thoughts. Bichlal ervahi, that's what's considered erva. And it will be prohibited to recite Shema in front of an area which is usually covered. So anything which is usually covered, even in the house, one should not be reciting Shema in front of, even if it's one's own wife. That is what we see from this source, because it's all considered under the general category of erva. Let's look at the if we go further in the next source, in source 13. The Mishnah Berurah goes further there and explains that ideally, when it comes to just closing one's eyes, that's not really an ideal solution either, and it should only be used as a last resort. So if one says, okay, so one's wife's not undressed, or by the way, this was very apparent when in COVID, when you had COVID minyanim outdoors, and then you had people running up and running up and down the street who weren't always best dressed, and you get to Shema and you've got your talit and your tefillin on, you're an outdoor minyan, and people are running around, not so sanua. So the question is, what do you do? Is it good enough to close one's eyes, or do you have to actually turn away? So this is actually discussed here in source 13 in the Mishnah Berurah. He says, according to what we saw in the Achronim, the neged erva mamash asur afilu ba'otzim einav ad sheyachzir panav, that it's forbidden to actually even to the erva, even by closing one's eyes, that's not enough. Ad sheyachzir panav, one actually actively turn away. It's not enough just to close one's eyes, it's to actually turn the other way. Hu hadin bezed, the same would apply here. A woman who's a bit undressed, so let's say one's wife is undressed or whatever, one would not be allowed to recite Shema. One would actually, by closing one's eyes, one would have to actually turn away, turn to the side. Some allow just closing one's eyes, and that's good enough. So if it's impossible to do otherwise, then let's say somebody's in Amida, right, and then somebody inappropriate drives past, right, or runs past, and you're in an outdoor COVID minyan. So closing one's eyes, if there's no other choice, then it's enough. But it's all, even in that case, I would say it's good to cover one's eyes with a siddur or something like that, because that's the psak of the Mishnah Berurah and the Ashkenazi Achronim. The Sfaradim are more makel on this. I think Rav Yitzchak, yep, they bring in here. Source 14, the Rav Yitzchak Yosef, the Sfaradim are more makel, and they say closing one's eyes is always good enough. So even if one was undressed or somebody not sanoah were to run past in the middle of your COVID minyan or whatever it is, closing one's eyes would be good enough, at least for Sfaradim, as ruled by in source 14, the Yalkut Yosef. He says, here we don't need to read the whole thing, but the second paragraph in source 14, he says, Aval neged tefach be'isha erva, opposite tefach of a revealed exposed area of a woman, v'chen se'ar be'isha erva, shemid rabbanan, which is all rabbinic, not reciting Shema in front of a woman's uncovered hair or just an area of skin. Shapir dami lahakel batzimat einaim. It's enough to just to close one's eyes. Certainly for us, i.e. Sfardim, Shanu Halchim Tamid Achar Harat Maran, we always follow the Shulchan Aruch. Fu Pasak Shulchan Aruch Lahatir B'zeh, he allows it. V'chein Hiskimu Harbe Achronim Lat Maran, and many of the Achronim agree to the Shulchan Aruch. But Tov Yatel Levarach Mitoch HaSidur, it's always best always to look inside the Sidur. Okay, this is what the Alkut Yosef rules. But for Ashkenazim, ideally, it's best to look or to turn aside. What if one didn't? Are they Yotze B'diavad? Ones who recite Shema in front of somebody who's not fully dressed or whatever. Do they have to recite Shema again, or are they Yotze? So the Shulchan Aruch, the Mishnah Berurah here in the next source rules that B'diavad, one does not necessarily have to go back and read again. He says as follows in source 15, Asul Ikrot, I'm a Prima Gadim. Look at the Prima Gadim. Shehevi Deat Le'inyan Divyavad Bezeh. Prima Gadim brings different opinions as to B'diavad, if post facto one had actually read Shema in front of somebody undressed. Would one have to read again? Like one would if somebody actually read in front of actual erva. If somebody was actually undressed fully, then one would have to read again. What about just if they read in front of people who are not dressed properly? The Derech HaChaim says that even B'diavad one would have to reread. Nonetheless, it seems to me, says the Mishnah Berurah, that one didn't intend to literally gaze at the person. They just happened to, let's say, as I said, go past the window, or you're in a street minion and they happen to run past. Even if it's a different woman, not one's own wife. And Rav Kook puts it very nicely. I said we don't too often quote Rav Kook in his halachic works, but he has a shut called Arach Mishpat. And here he really explains why that's okay, that B'diavad not to recite. So let's have a look at Rav Kook here in source 16. In his Arach Mishpat, he says, in my humble opinion, what's the reason? That from the language of the Rambam, Perek Gimel Mehilchot Kriyat Shema, the yesh chiluk, that there's a difference between erva mamash, between actual erva, actual nakedness, uvein isur erva to guf ha'isha nikret erva, and between that which we call erva, let's say any area, let's say on exposed body of, let's say a woman who's not dressed, so sanua. Dahatam, because in that case, vadai ikar ta'ama have mishum hirhu. In that case, not in its actual erva, actual nakedness, but when we're just talking about somebody who's not dressed in a modest manner, the whole prohibition is because of hirhu, because of inappropriate thoughts. Al-Ken, therefore, next paragraph. Al-Ken Katav, that's why he writes, the Keneget Erva Asra Achiyachsir Panav. That's why the Rambam says the opposite actual erva, i.e. actual somebody who's actually undressed, one has to look the other way. But later on, Gabe Kol Gufa Isha, but just about a woman who's not dressed in the most modest fashion, Katav, the Rambam just writes, Shelo Yistakel, they should not look or gaze. Mashma, that implies Hakol She'eno Mistakel Shapir Dam. As long as somebody isn't staring or gazing, then that's good enough. Al Kenir Er, therefore it seems, says Rav Kook, the Gabe Erva Mamash, by actual Erva, Lo Mahaniat Simat Enaim, covering one's eyes isn't enough. Avo Be Erva Di Isha, but just because a woman who's not dressed in the most appropriate manner, the Mishum Hirhu, which is because of inappropriate thoughts, Mahane Vadat Simat Enaim. So he makes a great chiluk here. It's good lomdus, actually. So even about this bizarre sort of halakha, we get some good lomdus. That when it comes to actual erva, actual exposing of a part of a body, the private areas of a person, then the issue is the presence. And therefore, closing one's eyes isn't good enough. One should not be reciting Shema in an area where somebody is actually undressed. It's the presence. Closing your eyes doesn't help, certainly for Ashkenazim. And for Sfardim as well. We said when for actual erva. But when it comes to just let's say a woman who's not dressed in the most modest manner, so then the issue isn't reciting in front of erva. That's not real erva. It's just there's a concern about inappropriate thoughts on behalf of the man, and therefore if he were to close his eyes, that would be enough, because then he removes the issue of hirhur, of inappropriate thoughts. Nonetheless, even despite this interesting logic in this chiluk, this difference that he describes, even for Ashkenazim, it's best to actively look the other way and not just to cover if there's an immodest person running past, or let's say somebody's member of one's family is undressed and the like. Okay, this is all a little bit bizarre. But we'll finish off just by looking at the. I'm going to skip. Actually, I want to skip to to source 18 on page 225. And I want to discuss what about nowadays when many women don't necessarily cover their hair. Does that change things around a little bit in terms of at least the hair? The rest of the body not, but let's say, I don't know, like you sit in shul, for example, and the Ezrat Nashim is full of women who, I mean, I presume here they're asked to cover their hair, but not everyone covers their hair. And there are shuls also where women they don't enforce the women to cover their hair. And especially if you're sitting on I'm being recorded, I have to be careful, but especially when you're sitting where I often sit when I'm giving a drasha, so you're elevated, so you're literally staring at the Ezrat Nashim the whole way through davening. Or just in general, forget that. Even if one's at home with one's wife and one's wife is dressed, but she hasn't got a kisei rosh on. So does one have to turn the other way? Maybe the fact that women, obviously it's not correct, but the fact that many women don't cover their hair at all maybe changes the reality of whether we look at hair as being something inappropriate or not. So this is a discussion here. Mishnah Berurah says it doesn't make a difference, and hair is still an issue. In source 18, he says, even if a woman, here he starts by saying, even if she doesn't cover her hair at home and she only covers it outside the house, so it's still considered an erva according to everyone, even in the house. And therefore, even if a woman, she usually doesn't cover her hair in the house, she only covers it out the house, still one should not recite Shema in front of it, even with one's own wife. But no further. Even if the minhag in that place, for whatever reason, is that the women don't cover their hair, unfortunately, asur, it's still prohibited. The fact that no one covers the hair in the community, that doesn't make it that you're allowed to read in front of her hair. It doesn't change the reality that hair is still something which is supposed to be covered. In the same way that if her thigh were to be uncovered, it still doesn't, just because people wear mini skirts, doesn't allow you to recite Shema in front of a mini skirt. Since according to halacha, women really are obligated to cover their hair. So the Mishnah Berurah was clear that the reality that unfortunately the practice became that women weren't covering their hair, that doesn't change anything in terms of not reciting Shema in front of hair. But not everyone agrees with Mishnah Berurah. The Aruch HaShulchan said famously that because women were not covering their hair, it just changed the reality. Doesn't mean it's mutter, it doesn't mean it's allowed necessarily that women don't cover their hair, but it means that it wouldn't be an issue of a man reciting Kriyat Shema in front of uncovered hair. So he says this in source 19 here, the Aruch HaShulchan. He says, and now, about the breaches in our generation, but due to our many sins, it's already been for many years, that women basically have breached in this area, and the practice has become that women don't cover their hair. And despite everyone complaining, it hasn't helped, and the practice has become that women are not covering their hair. Over the page, mihu. However, al kol panim, nonetheless, ladina, in terms of halacha, nira, it would seem, demutar lanu lehitpalel ulevarech neged rashen hamugulot. Even though it's not correct, because as a result of this, one would be allowed to daven and say brachot in front of women whose hair is uncovered. Kivan she'ata, because now ruban holchot kach, havekemakomot magulim begufa. Since now most women, certainly in Aruch HaShulchan's town, most women walk around, don't cover their hair. And therefore, it's not inappropriate to be looking at a woman's hair when one's reciting Shema. So he disagrees with the Mishnah Berurah. And he says that because, sadly, the custom came, the overwhelming custom, women don't cover their hair at all, it became less of an issue. And he, unlike the Mishnah Berurah, says that as a result, one would be allowed to recite Shema and Brachot in front of uncovered hair because that's become the social norm. It doesn't mean it's correct, but it means that it's not seen as erva. It's not seen as uncovered part of the body, and it would just be like her hand or her face, which are typically not covered, and there'll be no issue reciting in front of. We'll end there because we've got Mariv next door, but it's a bit of a weird one. But again, it's just showing you like the fact that parameters which we would only apply to about another woman would apply to one's own wife from reciting Shema show you about the sort of the seriousness of what Shema is. That one would not be things, typical situations which one would allow to be in the home. When it comes to Shema, we expect higher standards of ourselves, even in the presence of one's own family. And that ultimately, I think, is more than anything an important lesson to learn from this. Right, that's for sure.
But if it's an unmarried woman, it's different.
Right. If it's an unmarried woman, the only difference was hair.
Yeah.
Right.
And then also.
Because unmarried women they have no obligation
What
to cover
about
their hair.
married non-Jewish women?
Different discussion. Okay, we'll end there because of Marif. We'll continue next week. Be'ezrat Hashem.
No, but
Shakuach.
if you're on the